The fundraising gala for the Vancouver Children's Hospital occupied the entire rooftop of the Fairmont Pacific Rim, and Liu Zhang had spent 6 weeks choosing the suit he was wearing. His husband did not notice it. Leo had been standing near the bar for 43 minutes when he realized Alexander had not looked at him once since they arrived. Not a glance. Not the brief acknowledgement that passes between two people who have shared a life for 7 years. Nothing. Alexander moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who had never once questioned his right to occupy space. He was 42, silver at the temples, broad-shouldered in a charcoal brioni that probably cost more than Leo's monthly salary as a pediatric surgeon. His smile was a weapon. Charming, disarming, calibrated to make everyone in its vicinity feel briefly, exquisitely important. He shook hands with the mayor, clapped a tech billionaire on the shoulder, laughed at something a television anchor said that was not particularly funny. His arm occasionally draped around shoulders that did not belong to Leo. Leo watched him from across the room, his own champagne glass growing warm in his hand, and tried to remember when he had stopped being the person Alexander looked for in a crowded room. There had been a time, early on, when Alexander's eyes would find him automatically, a gravitational pull, an instinct. Leo had been 24 then, fresh out of medical school, so stunned by the attention of a man like Alexander Chun that he had barely known what to do with it. Alexander Chun, 42, Alpha, CEO of Chun Maritime Holdings. One of the most powerful men on the West Coast, if you believed the business magazines. And if you knew where to look for the real power, you understood that the magazines only scratched the surface. Leo was 31. Omega, a pediatric surgeon at Vancouver General who had spent the past 7 years trying to prove he was more than the sum of his secondary gender, more than the husband of a man who collected influence the way other men collected wine. He had been standing near the bar for 43 minutes. He was still standing there. He was still waiting. Across the room, Alexander leaned close to whisper something to a woman in a backless red gown. Some junior minister or other. Leo had lost track, and she laughed and touched his lapel, and Leo looked down at his champagne and felt something in his chest go very, very still. 7 years. 7 years of being introduced as an afterthought. This is my husband, Leo, he's a doctor. As if that were the end of the sentence. As if there were nothing more to say. 7 years of canceled dinners and rescheduled weekends, and the particular loneliness of lying awake next to someone who had already left without moving. The warmth of Alexander's body beside him in the dark, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the absolute absence of anything that felt like connection. Alexander would reach for him sometimes in the middle of the night, half asleep, his hand finding Leo's hip or his shoulder, and Leo would lie there frozen, waiting for something more, something that never came. In the morning, Alexander would be gone before Leo woke, already at the office, already moving through a world that did not include his husband. Leo had tried. God, he had tried. He had tried in the ways that Omegas are encouraged to try, with patience, with understanding, with the persistent quiet hope that things would shift, that the man he had married was still somewhere inside the polished executive who barely remembered his birthday, that the bond that had once felt so urgent, so undeniable, was just buried under the weight of Alexander's ambition. He had tried with heat suppressants and scent blockers, because Alexander preferred him neutral, because Alexander had always been uncomfortable with the visible markers of Leo's secondary gender. You're more than that, he would say, and Leo had believed him, had believed it was a compliment, had believed for a very long time that being more than an Omega meant pretending the Omega part of him didn't exist. He had tried with chemistry and with counseling and with the desperate, grasping hope that if he just gave enough, sacrificed enough, shrank himself small enough, Alexander would eventually notice. He had tried to be the perfect Omega for a man who had never actually wanted an Omega at all. He set his glass down on the nearest surface, a tray held by a passing server, whose name he knew, because he had made a point of learning the names of all the staff, because Alexander called it sentimental and Leo's grandmother had called it basic decency, and walked toward the elevator. The November air over Vancouver Harbor hit him like a cold hand when he stepped outside. He had not brought a coat. He had not planned to leave. He stood on the pavement outside the hotel, his breath making small clouds in the dark, and he felt the precise moment when something he had been holding for a very long time finally let go. It was not dramatic. It was not accompanied by tears or rage or any of the things he had imagined feeling in this moment. It was simply a release, a loosening of a grip he had not even realized he was maintaining. He stood there for a long moment, letting the cold air wash over him, letting himself feel the absence of the noise and the lights and the performance. The city hummed around him, traffic on the bridge, the distant sound of a ferry horn, the gentle lap of water against the seawall, and he let himself be part of it, just another person in the vast machinery of the city, anonymous and free. He walked. This was what he always did when the penthouse felt too small, too empty, too much like a monument to someone else's ambition. He walked along the seawall while the freighters sat dark and enormous in the water, while the city lights fractured in the wake of the float planes, while his heels clicked against the wet path, and he thought about nothing useful at all. He walked past the marina, past the rows of gleaming yachts that belonged to people like Alexander, past the couples strolling hand in hand, past the runners with their earbuds and their determination. He walked until his feet hurt and his ears were numb and the cold had seeped through his suit jacket and made him shiver. He walked because walking was the only thing that made sense. He texted his sister first. Left the gala. I'm fine. I'll explain later. His sister Clara was 2 years older, a marine biologist who lived in Victoria, who had never quite trusted Alexander, who had once told Leo that an alpha who needed you to be smaller was not an alpha worth having. Leo had not listened then. He was listening now. Then he typed a message to Alexander that he stared at for a full minute before sending. I am done trying. Do not wait up. He turned off his phone before the response could come. He had known, he supposed, for a long time. You do not arrive at the end of a marriage in a single evening. You arrive there after 100 small betrayals. 100 moments of choosing to believe things would improve. 100 dinners eaten alone while the food cooled and the texts went unanswered. 100 heats spent suppressing everything natural because Alexander found it inconvenient. Because Alexander had always made him feel that his biology was something to be managed rather than something to be celebrated. The gala had simply been the moment he could no longer pretend he did not know what he knew. It was the moment when the accumulation of all those small betrayals finally outweighed the hope that things would change. His feet carried him into Gastown eventually, because his feet always carried him toward the oldest parts of the city when he was troubled. He pushed through the door of a diner on Water Street that he had been coming to since his residency days, when he was a surgical intern surviving on bad coffee and borrowed sleep. The bell above the door had the same cracked tone it always had. The booth by the window was empty. He ordered coffee. He sat. He watched the steam rise from the mug and thought about his mother, who had told him once that the bravest thing a person could do was admit when something was finished. His mother had spent 32 years with an alpha who did not deserve her, and she had said this at the end with something that sounded almost like relief. Leo had never fully understood that relief until now. Now he felt it, a quiet hum beneath the cold, the knowledge that he had finally stopped fighting for something that was never going to be what he needed it to be. The diner was nearly empty at this hour. A cook in a white apron was wiping down the grill. A waitress with tired eyes was refilling salt shakers at the counter. The jukebox was playing something old and sad, a country song about leaving and regret, and Leo let it wash over him. He was 40 minutes into his second coffee when his phone rang. He had turned it back on without quite deciding to, and now he stared at the screen with the particular bafflement of someone whose life has just refused to follow a predictable course. The name on the screen was Julian Thorne. Leo had met Julian Thorne exactly 4 times. At his wedding, where Julian had been Alexander's most prominent guest, a man who occupied space differently than other people, as if the room had made adjustments for him. At a dinner the following Christmas, where Julian had asked him quiet, serious questions about his work in pediatric surgery, and actually listened to the answers. Once at a charity auction where Julian had outbid everyone for a piece of art Leo had been eyeing. And once briefly at a reception where Leo had spent 20 minutes in genuine conversation with him before Alexander appeared and steered him away with the kind of tension Leo had learned not to ask about. Leo knew what Julian Thorne was. He had understood it slowly and then all at once, the way you understand most things about the world you have married into. Julian was not in shipping, not exactly. He was in everything and nothing. In the spaces between legitimate enterprise, where very old money made very careful arrangements with very powerful people. His family controlled half the port operations on the West Coast, and the other half knew better than to cross them. He was 53, an alpha of the old school, the kind who did not need to announce his power because it was simply assumed. There were rumors about Julian Thorne, that he had once broken a man's hand for touching something that belonged to him, that he had sent another man to prison with nothing more than a phone call, that he had never lost a business negotiation in his life. But Leo had always found him unexpectedly gentle in their brief conversations, his dark eyes warm, his attention focused entirely on whoever he was speaking to. Leo pressed the button. Dr. Zhang. Julian's voice was measured, unhurried. He had a voice like a room that had been designed for quiet conversations. Deep, resonant, with an undertone of something that might have been warmth if you didn't know better. I understand this evening has been difficult. Leo almost laughed. That's one way to put it. Are you somewhere safe? The question stopped him. Not where are you, or what were you thinking, or any of the 1,000 other questions that might have followed. Are you somewhere safe? As if Leo's safety were the primary concern. Leo felt something shift unexpectedly in his chest. He had not realized until that moment how rarely anyone asked him that question. How rarely anyone thought to check whether he was okay, whether he was protected, whether he needed help. Alexander never asked. Alexander assumed Leo could take care of himself, and Leo had learned to assume the same. But Julian was asking, and the simple fact of the question made Leo's throat tight. I'm in a diner in Gastown. I'm fine. A pause. Stay where you are. I'm sending someone. Mr. Thorne, I don't need. I know you don't need it. Julian's voice was patient without being condescending, a difficult balance that he managed effortlessly. But there are things you deserve to know before you decide your next steps. Things about the situation you are leaving and what that situation may still mean for you. Another pause, measured and careful. I am not calling to alarm you. I am calling because you are a man of considerable intelligence, and you deserve to make your decisions with complete information. The line went quiet. Leo sat with the phone in his hand and the coffee cooling in front of him and tried to determine whether he was frightened or simply very awake for the first time in years. He thought about Julian's face, the way he had looked at Leo at that charity auction, the way he had listened to Leo talk about his work as if it mattered, as if Leo mattered. He thought about the 20 minutes at that reception, the way Alexander had appeared with that tight smile and steered him away. He had not thought about those moments in years, but now they came back to him with strange clarity. Julian had been watching him. Julian had been paying attention. Julian had been waiting. 20 minutes later, a man in a dark coat came through the door and found him without difficulty. He was perhaps 40, with careful eyes and the particular stillness of someone trained in close protection. He did not offer his name. He said simply that Mr. Thorne was waiting, and that Leo was welcome to refuse, and that if he refused, he would see Leo safely to a hotel of his choosing. Leo thought about that for a moment. He thought about the penthouse, empty and cold. He thought about the apartment in Kitsilano, dusty and unused. He thought about the diner, warm and anonymous, and the fact that he had nowhere else to go. Then he gathered his coat and followed the man out. The drive took them through the city and across the bridge into West Vancouver, climbing into the hills above the water. Leo watched the city lights recede behind them, watched the houses grow larger and more secluded, watched the trees close in around the road. The driver did not speak, and Leo was grateful for the silence. He watched the water slide past below them, dark and vast. And he thought about how strange it was to be here, in this car, heading toward the house of a man he barely knew. But it didn't feel strange. It felt right. It felt like the first right thing he had done in a very long time. The house, when it emerged from behind an iron gate and a winding private road lined with Douglas firs, was nothing like what he might have imagined. It was not the kind of place that announced itself. It was cedar and glass and restraint, built into the hillside so that from the front it appeared almost modest, and from the back overlooked the Strait of Georgia with a kind of view that had no adequate description. Leo had seen grand houses before. Alexander's world was full of them. But this one was different. It felt lived in, worn in, like a place where people actually existed rather than just performed. Julian Thorne met him at the door himself. He was 53, Leo knew, though he carried it in the way of men who have lived with physical discipline their entire lives. Silver hair, dark eyes, the kind of face that would have been handsome at 30 and had matured into something more interesting. He was broad-shouldered and tall, dressed casually for the first time Leo had ever seen him, in a dark sweater and dark trousers. And he looked at Leo with an expression Leo could not quite categorize. There was concern there, certainly. But there was something else too, something warmer, something that made Leo's stomach flip. "Thank you for coming," Julian said. "I know this is unusual." "Unusual is one word," Leo agreed. Julian led him into a room at the back of the house, all glass and warm wood, with a fire going and the city lights glittering far below over the water. He poured Leo a scotch without asking and set it in front of him on the coffee table, then settled into the chair across from him with his own glass and gave Leo the full weight of his attention. Leo was acutely aware, suddenly, of his own scent. He had been suppressing it for so long that he sometimes forgot what it actually was, something warm and green, like the forest after rain, his mother had said once. He had been using blockers for years, because Alexander preferred it, because Alexander had always seemed uncomfortable with the evidence of Leo's biology. But Julian didn't seem uncomfortable now. He simply sat there, looking at Leo with those dark eyes, and Leo felt something in his chest shift again. "You are leaving Alexander," Julian said. It was not a question. "Yes." Julian nodded slowly. "I want to be very direct with you, Leo, because I think you prefer directness, and because you have earned the truth about several things." He turned his glass in his hands. "Alexander has made a significant error. Not tonight at the gala. A financial error. A serious one. Involving funds that were not his to use and arrangements that were not his to make." Leo felt the bottom of his stomach drop. "What kind of arrangements?" "He borrowed from operations that belonged to my family." Julian said it without inflection, without drama. Borrowed is perhaps the generous interpretation. Redirected is more accurate. He has been doing this for approximately 14 months, covering a series of private losses he did not want reflected in the company accounts. Leo set down his scotch. His hands were very steady. This surprised him. He was a surgeon. He had learned long ago that his hands stayed steady when everything else was falling apart. "How much?" Julian told him. The number was large enough that Leo felt it physically, a cold clarity settling over him. "Why are you telling me this?" Julian looked at him steadily. "Because you are about to begin divorce proceedings, and the way those proceedings are structured matters significantly given what I have just told you. Because there are people in my world who have until now extended a certain professional courtesy to Alexander because of his connection to you. That courtesy has limits, and it has been nearly reached." He paused. "And because in 4 years of watching you attend functions and endure being overlooked, and occasionally speaking with you long enough to understand who you actually are, I believe you deserve to enter your next chapter with your eyes open." Leo absorbed this for a long moment. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a container ship moved silently through the darkness below, its lights reflecting in the water. "You're warning me," he said. "I am offering you information. What you do with it is your choice." "And what do you want in return?" Something moved behind Julian's eyes. Not a flinch, something more complicated than that. Something that looked almost like hope, though Julian Thorne was not a man who seemed to hope for anything. Nothing immediately, he said. Later, perhaps. I would like the opportunity to continue a conversation we have never quite been allowed to finish. Leo looked at him. Julian looked back. Neither of them looked away. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who were finally, after years of brief encounters and interrupted conversations, actually seeing each other. I need somewhere to sleep, Leo said finally. I can't go back to the penthouse tonight. Julian stood without ceremony. The east guest room has a view of the water. I'll have Mrs. Aldrich make it ready. Leo slept better than he had in months, which should have disturbed him, and somehow did not. He lay in the bed, linen sheets, a down comforter, the sound of water lapping against the shore far below, and felt the tension drain out of him in a way it hadn't in years. He had forgotten what it felt like to relax. He had forgotten what it felt like to not be braced for disappointment, for dismissal, for the thousand small humiliations that had become the texture of his marriage. In the morning, there was coffee and fruit on a tray outside his door, and a note in a precise, unhurried handwriting that said simply, "No pressure. Stay as long as you need. JT." He stayed 4 days. He told himself he was staying because he needed to make legal arrangements, which was true. He told himself he was staying because he did not want to face the penthouse, which was also true. He did not examine the third reason too closely, which was that he had not felt this particular quality of attention from another person in longer than he could easily remember. Julian looked at him like he mattered. Julian listened to him like what he had to say was important. Julian was present in a way Alexander had never been, even at the beginning. Julian did not hover. He had a household to run, and Leo gradually understood an organization considerably larger than his household, and he moved through both with a quiet authority that made no demands on Leo. He made himself available at meals, where they talked about Leo's work and Julian's shipping interests and the particular nature of the city they both loved. And in the evenings sometimes, when Julian would invite him to the library where a fire was kept going, and where Julian would read while Leo caught up on medical journals he had been neglecting. Julian had 6 books of poetry on the side table next to his reading chair. Leo noticed this and asked about it, and Julian talked for 20 minutes about Leonard Cohen, who had also lived in Montreal before choosing the solitude of an island, and who had understood something essential about the relationship between music and silence. It was the most Leo had heard him speak at one time. Leo thought he could have listened for considerably longer. There was something hypnotic about Julian's voice, the way it wrapped around words and made them feel important, the way it made Leo feel like the only person in the world. On the second morning, Leo found himself in the kitchen at 7, and Julian was already there, making coffee. He was wearing a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled up, and Leo caught himself staring at the line of his shoulders, the way the muscles moved under his skin. Julian turned and caught him looking, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Julian smiled. A small smile, barely there, but genuine, and Leo felt his face flush. "Couldn't sleep?" Julian asked. "Never can, in new places." Julian nodded and poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the counter in front of him. "You'll get used to it." And Leo realized, in that moment, that Julian was assuming he would stay. That Julian wanted him to stay, and the thought didn't frighten him the way it should have. On the third morning, Leo received a courier envelope. Alexander's lawyers had moved faster than he expected. The divorce petition included a proposed asset settlement that reflected very precisely only the assets that could be publicly traced to Leo. The private accounts, the shared investments, the careful financial architecture of their marriage, none of it appeared. Alexander had hidden it, and he had done it efficiently, and the proposed settlement was an insult dressed as a formality. Leo sat in the garden room with the papers on his knee and felt something that was not quite grief and not quite fury, something drier and colder than either. He had known Alexander was capable of cruelty, but this was different. This was a calculated, methodical attempt to erase Leo entirely, to pretend that their shared life had never happened. Julian found him there at noon and said nothing for a while. Then, "May I?" Leo handed him the papers. Julian read them without expression. He's offering you almost nothing, Leo said. He is offering you precisely what he believes he can get away with. Julian set the papers down. He is wrong about that. But correcting his impression will require a lawyer who understands the full scope of what has happened. He looked at Leo. I can provide the name of one. Someone who practices very good law and who also understands the particular complexity of our situation. Our situation, Leo repeated. Your situation, Julian amended without apology. I misspoke. Leo did not think he had misspoken. He called the lawyer that afternoon. The lawyer's name was Prescott Halford, and he was already familiar with the matter. Leo looked at Julian across the kitchen table, where he had made the call. You were already prepared for this. I had some thoughts, Julian said, about how things might unfold. You were 3 steps ahead. I try to be. He paused. Leo, you do not have to navigate this alone. That is all I am saying. Leo had been navigating things alone for a long time. He was not certain he remembered how to accept help, and he told Julian this, and Julian listened without trying to fix it, which was its own kind of help. Leo stayed. Not because he had nowhere to go. He had the small apartment in Kitsilano he had kept in his own name before the marriage, a habit his grandmother had called wisdom. He had his position at Vancouver General. He had a sister in Victoria and friends he had let drift too far and colleagues who respected him. He had a life, a full and capable life, entirely independent of Alexander Chun. He stayed because he had chosen to. And something about that distinction mattered enormously. The days became a rhythm. Morning coffee with Julian, who was always awake first. Brief conversations over breakfast before Julian disappeared to handle whatever vast empire he managed. Leo would spend the day making calls, meeting with Prescott Halford, beginning the process of disentangling his life from Alexander's. In the evenings, Julian would return, and they would sit in the library or the garden room, and Leo would find himself telling Julian things he had never told anyone. About his mother, about his residency, about the lonely years of trying to be everything Alexander wanted and never quite succeeding. Julian listened. He always listened. He never interrupted, never offered unsolicited advice, never made Leo feel like his problems were small. He just listened and nodded and occasionally asked a question that showed he had been paying attention. On the 5th night, Leo found himself in the library alone. Julian was on a call in his study, and Leo had picked up one of the poetry books from Julian's side table. It was Leonard Cohen, of course. He flipped through it, not really reading, and found a passage marked with a thin strip of paper. I had no choice in the matter. The heart has its own geography, its own gravity. It pulls us toward things we cannot explain, and away from things we have spent years constructing. Leo read it 3 times. When Julian came into the library, Leo was still holding the book. That's one of my favorites, Julian said quietly. Leo looked up. You marked it. I mark a lot of things. Leo closed the book and set it down. Why did you call me that night? Julian was quiet for a moment. Then he sat in the chair across from Leo, the same chair he had occupied on the first night, and looked at him with that steady, unreadable gaze. Because I had been waiting for an excuse, Julian said. And I knew, the moment I heard what happened, that I wasn't going to let another opportunity pass. Leo's breath caught. What do you mean? I mean, I have been watching you for 4 years, Julian said. I have been watching you be overlooked and undervalued and treated like an accessory. I have been watching you smile when you wanted to scream, and make conversation when you wanted to hide, and be gracious when you had every right to be furious. He paused. I have been watching you, Leo, and I have wanted to do something about it for a very long time. Leo felt his face flush. I didn't know. Of course you didn't. You were married. You were loyal. You would never have. Julian stopped himself. I didn't call that night because I had an agenda. I called because I couldn't bear the thought of you being alone. The rest of it, the information, the arrangements, that was secondary. Leo didn't know what to say. He sat there, in the warm glow of the fire, and felt something crack open in his chest. He had spent so long feeling invisible, feeling like he didn't matter, feeling like he was just an extra in Alexander's life. And here was Julian Thorne, one of the most powerful men on the West Coast, telling him that he had been seen, that he had been noticed, that he had been wanted. I don't know what to do with that, Leo admitted. Julian smiled, a small, sad smile. You don't have to do anything with it. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just telling you the truth. 6 weeks after he had walked out of the Fairmont Pacific Rim, spring came tentatively to the hillside above the strait. The Douglas firs dripped. The crocuses pushed through the wet soil of the garden. Leo stood at the glass looking out at the water and felt for the first time in years that he was standing in a place where he actually belonged. Julian appeared at his shoulder with coffee, the way he did in the mornings now, quiet and unhurried and present in the particular way Leo had come to understand was simply how he existed. I want to show you something, Julian said. He led Leo through the garden, past the formal section near the house where the beds were already budding, to a gate at the far end Leo had never noticed. It led into a wilder space bordered by cedar and fir, where a stone path wound through overgrown lavender and dormant rose canes, and ended at a bench overlooking a deep view of the water and the mountains beyond. My husband built this, Julian said. He had not spoken of his husband before, not directly, and Leo heard the care in the way he said it. Daniel. He was a landscape architect. He said formal gardens were beautiful, but that a garden that had been allowed to grow according to its own instincts was where you could actually think. He was quiet for a moment. I haven't been out here in a while. I thought it was time. Leo sat on the bench. The stone was cold through his jacket. Julian sat beside him, close enough that Leo was conscious of the warmth of him, and for a while they were both quiet, looking out over the water. He died 7 years ago, Julian said. Pancreatic cancer. It was very fast, which the doctors said was a mercy, and which I have never quite been able to agree with. He turned to look at Leo. I have spent 7 years operating as if the part of me that was a person rather than a position died with him. Leo felt the weight of that land somewhere between his ribs. What changed? Julian looked at him for a long moment with the directness that was simply his way of being, without deflection, without performance. You answered the phone, he said. And then you asked the right questions. And then you stayed. Not because you needed to, but because you chose to. He reached out and took Leo's hand. His hand was warm and unhurried, like everything else about him. I find I am not indifferent to that. Leo looked down at their joined hands, and then up at Julian's face. He thought about all the reasons he should be cautious. He thought about his mother, who had said that the bravest thing was admitting when something was finished. He thought about the second bravest thing, recognizing when something was beginning. I am not indifferent either, Leo said. Julian lifted his hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it, a gesture that was formal and careful, and somehow the most intimate thing Leo had experienced in years. Then we are somewhere we have not been before, Julian said. Yes, Leo said. I think we are. The trouble, when it came, did not announce itself. Leo had been at the house for 2 months when Alexander appeared at the front gate one Tuesday evening. Not intoxicated, which was somehow worse. A man who arrives at your door drunk is a man in pain. A man who arrives collected and cold and smiling is a man who is calculated. Leo was in the library when the security system chimed, and the guard's voice came quietly through the intercom to inform Mr. Thorne that Mr. Alexander Chun was requesting access to the property. Julian looked at Leo. Leo looked back. No, Leo said, but I'll go to the door. Julian walked with him. Leo had not asked him to, and he had not announced it. He was simply there, which Leo was learning was his way of operating. Alexander was exactly as Leo had imagined him, in a well-cut coat, with the controlled expression of a man who had rehearsed the conversation. He looked at Leo first, and then with a calculation that Leo had seen him use on opposing counsel and business rivals, at Julian. I should have known, Alexander said quietly, almost pleasantly. All those charity functions, all those long conversations I was too busy to care about. Alexander, Leo said, keeping his voice even. Whatever you believe is happening here, this is not the time or the place. He is right, Julian said. His voice carried none of the performance of Alexander's. It was simply a fact, spoken flatly with the confidence of someone who does not need to perform certainty, because he simply possesses it. And this is private property. Alexander's pleasant expression held. I've been speaking with some people, he said, addressing Julian now with the tone of a man playing a card he has been saving. People who find your family's operations very interesting. People who have been looking for a reason to revisit certain old agreements. A silence passed over the entrance steps that had a specific temperature. I have been speaking with those people too, Julian said. For considerably longer than you have. He let a beat pass. I suggest you consult with your attorney before you continue this conversation. The current legal situation regarding your fiduciary management of company accounts is not favorable to additional complications. Alexander's pleasant expression faltered. Just slightly. Just enough. This isn't over, Alexander said. That, said Julian, is what people say when they have no remaining argument. He held the door until Alexander turned and walked back to his car. Then he closed it with the quiet efficiency of someone who has never needed to slam things. Leo stood in the foyer. He was aware that his hands were steady and that his heart was not. Julian turned to him. His face had returned to its normal expression, measured and watchful, and somewhere beneath both of those things, concern for Leo. He'll try again, Leo said. Perhaps. But he'll try knowing that his leverage is significantly smaller than he believed. Julian paused. I have been very thorough about that. How thorough? A ghost of something passed across Julian's face that was almost, but not quite, a smile. 3 steps ahead, as you once put it. Leo felt the tension release from his shoulders in a long exhale. You are a very complicated man. Yes, Julian agreed. I am. He extended his hand toward the library. Shall we go back to our books? Our books. Leo did not point it out. He took the offered direction and walked beside Julian back down the hall. The following months had their complications. The legal proceedings with Alexander required Leo's energy and his precision, and Prescott Halford proved to be exactly the kind of attorney who understood complicated situations and knew what to do with them. The settlement that emerged bore little resemblance to the insult Alexander had first proposed. Leo signed the final papers on a Tuesday morning in a downtown office tower, while the rain moved in off Burrard Inlet, and he walked out feeling lighter than he had expected. He also received information, gradually and without pressure from Julian, about the full nature of what Alexander had done, how he had moved money, who he had done it through, what he had believed would happen, and what had actually happened instead. Because Julian's family had not simply absorbed the loss, but had quietly, systematically ensured that every avenue Alexander had tried to use was already closed to him. You knew this might happen, Leo said one evening, late, when they were sitting in the garden room and the rain was running down the glass, and he had been thinking through the timeline. When you called me that night, you weren't only being protective, you were already managing it. Julian considered this. Both things can be true, he said. I called because I was concerned for you. I also called because the situation benefited from your knowing the truth before Alexander could use your ignorance as a tool. He looked at Leo. I did not deceive you. No, Leo said. You were very precise about what you told me and what you left for later. That is also accurate. Leo sat with that for a moment. This was one of the things he had come to understand about Julian. The importance of sitting with complicated things rather than resolving them artificially. He did not pretend to be uncomplicated. He did not pretend that the world he operated in was simple or entirely clean. He was instead rigorously honest about the compromises his position required and equally honest about the ones he had chosen not to make. I appreciate that you didn't lie to me, Leo said finally. It would not have been possible, Julian said simply. You are not a person it is possible to lie to for any length of time. Leo looked at him. Is that a compliment? It is an observation, Julian said, that functions as one. Somewhere between winter and spring, they stopped being careful around each other in the way that people are careful when they are pretending not to feel something. It happened slowly and then very suddenly, the way things that have been growing in the dark finally break through the surface. There was an evening in March when the last of the snow was melting off the cedars, and Leo found Julian in Daniel's garden at dusk, standing at the bench where they had sat together in the autumn, looking out at the water with the expression of a man having a conversation with someone who was no longer there. Leo went to him, and Julian turned when he heard him, and neither of them said anything for a while. Leo took his hand and held it. Eventually Julian said, very quietly, "He would have liked you very much." And Leo said, "I think I would have liked him." And that was all. But it was enough. And something settled between them after that which had no adequate word, but which they both felt and neither disputed. That night, Leo couldn't sleep. He lay in the guest room, his room, now, though neither of them had said it aloud, and stared at the ceiling, thinking about Julian's face in the garden, the way his voice had cracked when he said Daniel's name. Leo had never seen Julian vulnerable before. Julian was always so controlled, so careful, so deliberate. But in that moment, he had been open, raw, real. And Leo had seen him, truly seen him. Leo got out of bed and walked down the hall to Julian's room. He didn't know what he was going to say. He didn't know what he was doing. He just knew he couldn't be alone. He knocked softly. The door opened. Julian was standing there in a worn t-shirt and sweatpants, his silver hair slightly mussed, looking more human than Leo had ever seen him. "Leo." His voice was concerned. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." Leo shook his head. I couldn't sleep. I didn't want to be alone." Julian looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and held the door open. "Come in." Leo walked into Julian's bedroom. It was simple, understated, like everything else about the house. A large bed with dark linens. A reading lamp. A stack of books on the nightstand. It smelled like Julian, cedar and wood smoke, and something deeper, something that made Leo's omega instincts hum. Julian closed the door and turned to face him. "Do you want to talk?" Leo shook his head. "I don't know what I want. He stopped. "I just needed to be near you." Julian's expression softened. He crossed the room and took Leo's hands in his. "You can be near me," he said quietly. "You can be as near to me as you want. I'm not going anywhere." Leo looked up at him. In the dim light, Julian's face was all shadows and angles, and Leo wanted to touch it. He wanted to run his fingers over the silver at Julian's temples, the lines around his eyes, the firm set of his jaw. He wanted to know what it felt like to be held by him, to be surrounded by his warmth, to feel safe. "Julian," Leo said, and his voice came out softer than he intended. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to. I've never been with anyone who actually wanted me. Not really. Alexander just wanted someone to fill a space. He never wanted me." Julian's grip on his hands tightened. "I want you," he said. "I have wanted you for 4 years. I have watched you from across rooms and wanted to walk over and take your hand and never let go. I have imagined what it would be like to have you beside me, to come home to you, to wake up next to you." He paused. "I have imagined it for a very long time, Leo. And I am not a man who imagines things idly." Leo felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He blinked them back. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because you were married. Because you were loyal. Because I would never have done anything to put you in a difficult position." Julian's voice was steady, but Leo could hear the emotion beneath it. "But you're not married anymore. And I'm not going to wait any longer." He cupped Leo's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing Leo's cheekbones, and looked at him with such intensity that Leo felt his breath catch. "I need to know," Julian said. "Do you want this? Do you want me?" Leo nodded. "Yes, I want you. I've wanted you since the first time we spoke, I think. I just didn't know what to do with it." Julian smiled, a real smile, wide and warm and full of wonder. Then he leaned in and kissed him. It was soft at first, almost tentative. Julian's lips were warm and gentle, and Leo felt like he was melting into it, like his whole body was dissolving into the sensation. Julian's hands moved from his face to his shoulders, pulling him closer, and Leo made a small sound against his mouth that was half surprise and half relief. Julian pulled back just enough to look at him. "Was that okay?" Leo laughed, a little breathlessly. "That was more than okay. That was..." He shook his head. "I don't have words." "Good," Julian said. I don't either. He kissed Leo again, deeper this time, and Leo felt something slot into place in his chest, something that had been broken for so long, he had forgotten what it felt like to be whole. In April, without ceremony or extended preamble, Julian asked him to marry him. They were in the kitchen, of all places. Leo was making tea because he could not sleep, and Julian came downstairs and found him there, and they talked for an hour about inconsequential things. And then Julian said, in the same direct and unhurried tone he used for everything, I would like to build whatever comes next with you, Leo, if you are willing. Leo looked at him across the kitchen counter, with the tea cooling between them and the dark water glittering 300 meters below the windows. He thought about the man he had been at the gala, the man in the emerald suit whose husband did not look at him, the man who had stood outside a hotel in the November cold and felt something finally, irreversibly let go. That man had been braver than he knew. Yes, Leo said. I'm willing. They married in June in Daniel's garden, which Leo had spent 2 months restoring with the help of a young landscape architect he had found in Julian's files, a woman who had been a student of Daniel's and who cried when Leo told her what the project was. The roses were blooming. The lavender was full. The bench where Leo and Julian had first sat together was visible from the spot where they exchanged their vows. There were perhaps 30 people present. Leo's sister Clara, who had cried since breakfast. His colleagues from Vancouver General, who had expressed collectively some very colorful opinions about Alexander over the preceding months. A small number of people from Julian's world, men and women who were quietly formidable and who looked at Leo with an assessing respect he was beginning to understand was simply the register in which this world operated. And Alexander. Alexander did not come in the conventional sense. He came to the property line at the end of the lane and stood there with 2 men Leo did not recognize, at the precise moment during the reception when the guests were gathered on the lawn and the summer evening was long and golden and impossibly beautiful. Leo saw him before Julian did. I'll go, Julian said, turning. No. Leo touched his arm. Stay. He walked down the lawn to the gate himself. He was in his wedding suit, simple ivory silk, carrying nothing, and he thought as he walked about everything that had been required to travel the distance between that November night and this June afternoon. The grief of it, the unexpected grace of it, all of it. He stopped at the gate and looked at Alexander. Leo, Alexander said. He seemed prepared to say more, and then did not. Leo studied his face for a moment, the face he had once believed in completely, and he felt the clearest thing, not anger, not satisfaction, simply the clean, uncomplicated recognition that he had moved a very long distance from where he had stood. I hope you find something real, Leo said. He meant it. It was easier to mean it than he had expected. I genuinely do. He turned and walked back up the lawn without waiting for a response. Julian was where he had left him, watching. When Leo reached him, Julian took his hand and held it with the unhurried steadiness that was simply him. And around them the evening continued, and the roses continued, and the water below the hillside went on reflecting the long summer light. 5 years later, Leo stood in Daniel's garden with his daughter asleep in a pram in the shade of the cedar fence, and thought that the distance between any 2 moments of your life is impossible to measure until you have actually traveled it. His daughter's name was Aloan, which was a Cornish word for elm tree, because Julian had a fondness for old things with deep roots, and because Leo had always liked the sound of it, and because the elm in the front garden had been the first thing he had seen the morning after that November night, and he had taken it, without quite meaning to, as a kind of sign. Aloan was 3, with her father's dark eyes and Leo's stubbornness, which Julian referred to as clinical precision and which Leo's sister referred to as impossible. She was currently, in her sleep, very firmly grasping a leaf she had refused to relinquish, and this small fact made Leo feel something he still did not quite have a word for, something that occupied the place where worry used to live. Julian came through the garden gate with 2 mugs of coffee and handed Leo one without breaking his stride. She's still holding the leaf, Leo said. Of course she is, Julian said, looking at his daughter with the expression Leo had come to know as his most unguarded one. She comes by it honestly. They stood together in the June light, with the city spread below them and the mountains beyond the water, and the roses Daniel had planted still blooming in the beds Leo had restored. And Leo thought about a man who had once stood outside a hotel in November cold and done the bravest small thing. He had walked away from what was finished. "I've been thinking about something," Leo said. "What's that?" "The night you called me at the diner." Leo looked at him. "You had already made arrangements. You were already managing the situation. But you still asked if I was somewhere safe." Julian looked at him steadily. "You could have simply told me what you knew and what you needed me to understand," Leo said. "But you asked that first." Julian was quiet for a moment. "It mattered that you were safe," he said finally. "Whatever else was happening, that was not an arrangement. That was simply true." Leo looked out over the water for a moment. Then he leaned against Julian's shoulder, and Julian wrapped his free arm around him with the ease of something long and comfortably established between them. "Thank you," Leo said. "For what?" "For calling. For being honest about the complicated parts. For building this with me." Julian pressed his mouth to the top of Leo's head. "Thank you," he said, "for answering." In the pram, Eloan slept on with her leaf. And the garden her father had built a long time ago grew around them all in the summer light. And Leo felt, as he had felt now for several years, the particular piece of a life that belongs entirely to you, because you chose every part of it. Julian had never been a man who expressed himself easily in words. He showed his care in other ways. In the way he remembered how Leo took his coffee. In the way he always made sure the library was warm when Leo came home late from the hospital. In the way he had quietly arranged for Leo's mother to move into a beautiful assisted living facility on the North Shore when her health began to fail, without ever making it sound like anything other than a convenience. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, when the city was dark and the water was dark and the only light came from the fire in the garden room, Julian would reach for Leo in a way that needed no words at all. He would press his face into the curve of Leo's throat, where Leo's scent was strongest, now that Leo had stopped using blockers, now that he had finally learned to exist in his own skin, and he would breathe him in like a man who had been starving. Those were the moments Leo treasured most. The moments when Julian's careful control slipped, just slightly, just enough to show the depth of what he felt. The moments when his hand found the small of Leo's back and stayed there, warm and steady. The moments when he would look at Leo across a crowded room. At another gala, another fundraising dinner, another event where they moved through the world as a unit, and there would be something in his eyes that made Leo's breath catch. He looks at me like I matter, Leo thought. And it was such a simple thing, such a fundamental thing, and yet it had taken him so long to find it. There was a particular morning, about a year into their marriage, when Leo woke up in their room. It had never been the guest room. Not really, not after that first night. And found Julian already awake, propped on one elbow, watching him with that unreadable expression. "How long have you been awake?" Leo asked. "A while." "Staring at me?" "Staring at you." Julian agreed, without apology. Leo laughed, a little embarrassed. "Why?" Julian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very simply, "Because you're here. Because I still sometimes can't believe you stayed." Leo reached up and touched his face. "I stayed because you made it possible. Because you made it safe." "Safe," Julian repeated, as if testing the word. "Safe," Leo said firmly. "Not because you protected me from things, though you did, sometimes, but because you never asked me to be less than I am." Julian's expression softened. He turned his face into Leo's palm and pressed a kiss there. "I love you," he said. It was not the first time he had said it, but it was the first time Leo had heard it sound so simple, so uncomplicated, so free of any expectation or condition. "I love you too," Leo said, and he meant it in a way he had never quite meant it with anyone else. Eloan was born on a Tuesday, in the middle of a rainstorm that had the whole city underwater. Leo had been in surgery when his water broke, a complicated pediatric case that he absolutely could not leave, and he had finished the surgery because he was that kind of doctor. And then he had calmly walked himself down to the maternity ward and called Julian. Julian had arrived in under 20 minutes, which was impossible given the traffic and the weather, but he had arrived, and he had not said a word about Leo finishing the surgery, because he understood that was who Leo was. He had simply sat beside the bed, holding Leo's hand, and not looked away once. Aloan had come into the world with a scream that made the nurses laugh, and Julian had cried when they placed her in his arms, and Leo had looked at his family, his husband, his daughter, this life he had built from the ashes of something broken, and felt such a profound, overwhelming gratitude that it almost hurt. It was not a perfect life. There were still complications. Julian's world still operated in shades of gray that made Leo uncomfortable sometimes. There were still moments when Leo came home and found Julian in conversation with men who looked like they belonged in a crime drama, and Julian would explain, carefully, patiently, what was happening, and Leo would have to decide how much he could live with. But Julian had never lied to him, and Leo had never asked him to be anything other than who he was. And in return, Julian had given him something he had never expected to have, the freedom to be exactly who he was, without apology. An Omega, a surgeon, a husband, a father, all of it, not in spite of each other, but because of each other. On the evening of their 5th anniversary, Leo stood in Daniel's garden. Their garden now, the garden they had built together out of the bones of something old and beautiful, and watched the sunset over the water. Julian came up behind him and wrapped his arms around him, pulling him back against his chest. 5 years, Julian said. 5 years, Leo agreed. Any regrets? Leo turned in his arms and looked up at him. The sky was pink and gold behind Julian's head, and his silver hair was catching the light, and he looked so much like himself, so solid, so present, so utterly real, that Leo's heart ached with it. None, Leo said. Not one. Julian kissed him then, slow and deep, and Leo thought about the man he had been at that gala. The man in the emerald suit whose husband would not look at him. The man who had stood outside a hotel in the cold and let something go. That man had been brave. But this man, the one standing in this garden, in this city, in this life, was brave in a different way. This man had chosen. And he would keep choosing, every day, for the rest of his life. Tell me about the first time you saw me, Leo said later that night, when they were sitting on the bench in the garden, and Aloan was asleep upstairs, and the stars were coming out over the water. Julian considered this. Your wedding, he said. To Alexander. Tell me what you thought. Julian was quiet for a moment. I thought, he said slowly, that you were the most beautiful man I had ever seen, and I thought that you were wasted on him. Leo laughed. That's not very charitable. I wasn't feeling charitable. I was watching a man who didn't know what he had, and I thought, if that were me, I would never take my eyes off him. Leo felt his cheeks warm. And now, Julian turned to look at him. And now I still think the same thing. Except now you're mine, and I don't have to imagine what I would do with you. That's a very possessive thing to say. I am a very possessive man. Julian said it without shame. I don't share. I never have. And I certainly don't share you. Leo leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body. You don't have to. I'm not going anywhere. I know. Julian pressed a kiss to his hair. That's the part one still can't quite believe. In the end, Leo thought, that was what made it real. Not the grand gestures, though Julian was capable of those when the occasion demanded. Not the power or the money or the protection that came with being Julian Thorne's husband, though those things were undeniably part of the package. It was the small things. The way Julian always made sure there was fresh coffee in the morning. The way he remembered the names of every single person in Leo's surgical team, because Leo had told him once that it mattered. The way he would sit with Aloan for hours, teaching her the names of the plants in the garden, his deep voice steady and patient, his big hands so gentle with such a small child. The way he looked at Leo sometimes, when he thought Leo wasn't watching, with that expression of quiet wonder that made Leo's breath catch. You are the most beautiful man I have ever seen. Leo had stopped believing in fairy tales a long time ago. He was a surgeon. He knew that life was messy and complicated and often brutal. But this life, this love, this family, was as close to a fairy tale as he had ever come, and he intended to hold on to it with both hands. The anniversary party was small, by Julian's standards. Just the two of them and Clara and a few close friends, gathered in the garden under the fairy lights that Leo had insisted on stringing through the cedar trees. Aloan was running around barefoot, shrieking with delight, her dark curls bouncing and her tiny fists full of flowers she had picked from the beds. Clara was chasing her, also barefoot, laughing in a way Leo hadn't heard her laugh in years. Julian was beside him, one hand on the small of his back, warm and steady. "Happy anniversary," Julian said quietly. "Happy anniversary," Leo replied. And then he turned to look at his husband, his alpha, his partner, the man who had saved him without ever asking to be thanked. And he felt the weight of everything they had built together. "Do you ever think about that night?" Leo asked. "The night I left Alexander?" "Sometimes," Julian admitted. "What do you think about?" Julian was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I think about how brave you were. I think about how I knew, the moment I heard your voice on the phone, that I would do anything to keep you safe." Leo felt his throat tighten. "Julian, and I think about how lucky I am," Julian continued, "that you chose to stay." Leo reached up and touched his face. "I chose to stay because you made it easy, because you made it feel like home." Julian's expression softened. He covered Leo's hand with his own and pressed a kiss to his palm. "I love you," he said. "I don't say it enough, but I love you. I love Aloan. I love this life we've built together." Leo laughed, a little unsteadily. "You say it plenty. I mean it every time." "I know." Leo leaned in and kissed him, soft and slow, right there in front of everyone. "I know you do." Later, when the guests had gone and Aloan was asleep and the garden was quiet under the stars, Leo and Julian sat on the bench in Daniel's garden, looking out over the water. Julian's arm was around Leo's shoulders, and Leo was leaning against him, and the silence between them was the kind that didn't need to be filled. "I used to think I'd never find this," Leo said eventually. "After Alexander, I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone. Or if I was lucky, I'd find someone decent enough, someone who didn't treat me like an inconvenience. But I never thought I'd find this." "This," Julian repeated. "This." Leo gestured vaguely at the garden, the house, the water, the sky, all of it. "The feeling of coming home. The feeling of being exactly where I'm supposed to be." Julian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I used to think the same. After Daniel, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I'd spend the rest of my existence doing what I do, being what I am, and that would be enough." "Is it?" Leo asked. "Is it enough?" Julian turned to look at him, and in the starlight, his face was something Leo would never forget. "It is now," Julian said. "It is now because you're here. Because she's here. Because we built something together that I never thought I'd have again." Leo swallowed hard. "I love you," he said, because he needed to say it. Because it mattered. Julian pulled him closer and pressed a kiss to his forehead. "I know," he said. "I love you too." And that was it. That was the shape of their story. Not perfect. Not without complications. But real in all the ways that mattered. Leo had walked away from a gala on a cold November night, not knowing what would come next. He had wandered through the city with no plan, no direction, just the bone-deep certainty that he could not stay where he was. And then Julian had called. And Leo had answered. And everything had changed.